The new Foreign Affairs and Development Select Committee. We're beginning the meeting with the Permanent Secretary and a couple of his senior staff. Welcome to Sir Philip Barton, Corin, Robertson and Tim Jones. Thank you very much indeed for coming and for answering our questions. At least I hope you're going to answer our questions. So if I could begin with, there's a general one. So it's been reported, Sir Philip, that you're going to be stepping down in January. Could you tell us why you've decided to leave before completing your 5-year term?
Firstly, Chair, congratulations to you and the committee on your election as the first time I've appeared before the new committee after the general election. And I know that I speak for myself for the amount of time I have left in the role, but also for the whole department. We're looking forward to working with you and your colleagues on the committee. In response to your question, look, I'm well into my 5th year. Foreign Secretary and I discussed, in light of successful transition to a new ministerial team at the time, what made sense for transition to a new permanent secretary. He, as you know, has launched 3 reviews into the work of the department. I expect, alongside taking forward the transformation of the Parliament in light of the outcome of the second phase of the spending review, a big programme of work over the years ahead, and it makes sense for a new permanent secretary to take that forward with him.
So what's the expected timeline for the appointment of your replacement?
So the Civil Service Commission, in the usual way, has launched a competition together with the Cabinet Secretary, who is the line manager of the role. I think the deadline for applications is the end of this week, with interviews likely to be in the first week of December, and an appointment shortly thereafter. And then once we know who my replacement is, I would agree with whoever they are, a handover early next year.
Early next year? I mean, you're leaving in January?
I will. I mean, January is the aspiration, but in the end, I will make sure there's a smooth transition, and I won't leave the department in the lurch without a permanent secretary. So if January is possible, I'll do that. But there won't be a gap. No, I will be flexible.
So just looking back, therefore, on the time that you've spent in charge of the Foreign Office, what do you think you've learned? And I suppose the real question is if you knew now what you if you knew then what you know now, what would you have done differently?
It's a very good question, Chair. And obviously, as I come towards the end of my time, but also towards the end of my time in the diplomatic service, I've been a diplomat now for 38 years. It's a long career in that profession. I've reflected both on how my profession's changed, but also in response to your question, my time in the department. I started on day one of the newly merged department on the 2nd of September 2020 to be the first permanent Undersecretary of the new department, bringing together, as you know, diplomacy and development. And I think we have achieved a lot, and we are now settled as a single department, and the task ahead is to build from where we are and build the capability of the department, and the Foreign Secretary's 3 reviews will help guide all of that. We started when COVID was still kind of in between the first and the second wave here in the UK, and still a very, very serious challenge across the whole of the globe. I don't think in the autumn of 2020 people quite understood, and the department didn't understand quite how long it was going to continue and how deep the impact was going to be, including to our own finances, but also our ability to operate as a global organisation, which depends to a high degree on being able to have people overseas and to travel and to meet people. So I think the one lesson that I learned, and if I had my time again, would think about differently, is we were over-ambitious in what we had tried to achieve in the first phase of the merger, and I think the NAO's study, which they published in March of this year, into how the merger had gone and how we'd gone about it, brought this out. I think after about a year we realised that ambition couldn't be met, and we therefore pared back the transformation we're making to absolutely making sure that the basic fundamental foundations of a single department were what we prioritised. So making sure we had single accounts and a single system for our finances and HR, making sure we had a single IT system and the kind of backbone of a single department alongside the merged the merged teams and the merged leadership, which we put in the first 6 months. I think we had hoped to be more ambitious in that first phase, but particularly COVID, but also the reduction in overall resources had made it more challenging than I think any of us realised at the start. So that was my one big lesson.
So Dan's going to ask you some questions about the merger in a minute, but I just wanted, just on behalf, I suppose, of the public who are watching, and they were saying, well, we've got the permanent secretary in front of us, and he's been asked what's the thing that would change, he would have done differently. You would say that it would be the way in which the merger had happened. There wouldn't be anything else that the Foreign Office ought to have done differently over the last 4 or 5 years.
I think I think the other thing that we've definitely got better at is how our big challenge is the world has become more volatile, more contested, and less predictable. And we have a kind of business which a large amount of that is business as usual, whether that's delivering bilateral relations or engagements multilaterally or big development programs. And so there's a resource and a people resource required to that. But we also need to be able to flex into changing circumstances, whether that's an acute crisis like the one we saw in Afghanistan or in Sudan, or a long-term shift like what we've had to do in consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we've had a big programme of work over the last 3 years now to make the department more agile in the way in which we can deploy our people. And I think one of the things I'm proud of is I do think we've managed to do that, and we've managed to make ourselves more agile. So when we need to find additional people, for example, to step in to do more work on the Middle East, we've got better mechanisms for doing that. When we suddenly have an acute crisis, as we had in Bangladesh, again, we were able to find additional people through the acute period of that crisis and the change of government there. We were able to step into that. When we've had long-term shifts, as I've said, we've been able to increase the resource and find ways of doing that within an overall envelope. I mean, it remains very challenging and resources remain tight, and we have to carry on being very mindful of our duty to carry on doing business as usual, whether that's consular assistance, making sure our development money and other monies are spent properly and that sort of thing. But we have, as I say, we have had this big programme of making us more agile in response to a more challenging world, and also doing a better job. I mean, we can't predict the future, but doing a better, more organised job of thinking forward and what could be the big things that could hit us, and making sure we've got proportionate contingency plans for some of the biggest eventualities that might or might not come about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Sir Philip. Could I take you back to the difficult period of the handling of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the predecessor committee to this published damning reports. It said Afghan allies and British soldiers were utterly let down by deep failures of leadership. It accused your department of giving answers to MPs that were at best intentionally evasive and often deliberately misleading. It said the department and leadership should be ashamed that civil servants had to risk their careers by whistleblowing to unearth the appalling mismanagement of the crisis. And it took the extraordinary steps of calling for your resignation. And I just wonder how you reflect back on that period now, and whether you have any regrets for not taking the opportunity to resign back then. The one thing I've reflected on, I'm happy to repeat, and I said at the time, is I regret not returning from my leave during August of 2021. I said that at the time, and I stand by it. It's the biggest regret of my time in the role. In terms of the description of events you've just given, I think there's a few things I'd say in response. Firstly, we did successfully enable a large number of Afghans to leave through Operation Pithing. We had made some plans. We were the only country who had a evacuation handling centre in the environs of Kabul airport. We're the only country who'd made a prior plan for a staging post in the Gulf. But I also accept that the overall response wasn't sufficient. We were, as a department, overwhelmed in particular by the number of inquiries that we received and our ability to respond to them. But we did have a very, very large number. I can't remember the exact statistic, it was something like 200,000 in a space of a couple of weeks. So there was a big
big pressure. But we did actually help, alongside brave military colleagues and colleagues from the border force, help a very large number of Afghans out of Kabul in those days through those operations.
Do you think that episode...
So can I just finish the thought, if you wouldn't mind, just to complete my response? It was clear that there were lessons for us to learn. And I launched immediately that the immediate crisis response had finished, a detailed look at what those lessons were, appointed somebody senior within the department who knew the department but actually had not been directly involved with the team to go through that in a systematic way, work out what they were. I wrote to the previous committee in detail with the conclusions of that exercise. I think it was a six-page letter. And then I put in place a system within the department to make sure that it was followed up. I used the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee chaired by non-executive, so obviously someone external department, to hold us to account a year later for how we were doing with implementation, and then wrote a follow-up letter to the committee setting out how we'd learned the lessons, where we got to in that programme of work. And I think if you look at our ability to get people out of Sudan, our ability to assist people out of Lebanon over the summer, I think that demonstrates that we have put in place better systems, although the evacuations in those cases weren't of the same scale, better systems to respond to those sorts of crises.
Thank you. I wondered whether you felt that episode damaged your ability to lead as Permanent Secretary, and I want to link that to the last 4 years and the FCDO merger. And I know that previous Permanent Secretaries have driven through change with, so Simon Fraser had his Diplomatic Excellence Programme, Simon MacDonald, now Baron MacDonald, had Diplomacy 2020. And I don't think you've had a flagship programme of your own, but you have overseen the merger. And I wonder if you regret not being more proactive in sort of setting a vision from the top for the FCDO during your time.
So I have set a vision, including how I've gone about my own leadership, and I don't accept. One of the things I was humbled by was the wave of support I had from people in the department who wanted me to carry on as their leader through 2021 and 2022. It was really clear to me that people wanted me to lead them. We had a vision for the merger. We had a vision for what we were going to do by bringing diplomacy and development together. I think the world turned out to be more challenging than people expected at the time. We had, in addition to COVID I've mentioned, we had the very unexpected, very significant reduction in our development assistance budget from 0.7 to 0.5 from one day to the next, which led to us having to take about £3.5 billion out of our budget inside a financial year. The following year, we again had a very significant financial hit, further hit on our development budget through the dramatic increase in donor refugee costs. We had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a massive shock to international work overall. So there was a set of things which made it harder to achieve everything we wanted to achieve, as I said at the beginning, in terms of our vision for a merged department.
I know other colleagues are going to pick up on ODA and some of those points, but just specifically with overseas development coming in to the Foreign Office and perhaps seeing that as, with all the pressures that are now on that, including spending a lot of that money here in the UK, I still am missing a vision that brings those two things together.
So the vision, and it was set out at the time by the then Prime Minister, was to achieve more internationally by doing diplomacy and development together. So I'll give you a couple of immediate examples where I think you can see that we've done that. So, for example, when we had the Ukraine Recovery Conference and hosted that in the UK, a conference which raised more funding for reconstruction than any similar conference since the Second World War. We used both our diplomatic convening power but also our deep expertise on the development side about finance, how you bring in the public sector, how you can leverage insurance and that sort of thing. And I don't think we've achieved that without the merger. If you look at our response to Sudan, again, we were able both to use our development expertise and our deep expertise on how you do humanitarian program together with our political influence around things like like access. Both of those, I think, are examples of where we are achieving more.
I'm not sure I'd agree with things working better now than perhaps before the merger, but I know the chair wants to move on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. We ought to move on. I know that Edward's got some questions about the overseas estate.
I do. Obviously, there's been some sales recently, the Tokyo Embassy and the Bangkok Embassy, which between them raised about £1 billion. The autumn budget refers to investing funds from asset sales. I'm just wondering, what is it being invested in? Is that money being used to fund day-to-day operations? And of that pot of money, how much is left to draw down on?
First thing just to note is we only have capital from our estate through the sale of assets. That's been the model, I think, since 2010. The money is almost entirely used either for other estates capital projects where we need to refurbish or move to new premises, or for maintenance. Some of it, because it's capital, I think, has been transferred into funding for some of our digital and data investments, but it's essentially used for the estate. I think on current projections, Tim, you should have, but I think on current projections, we think that the current asset recycling we've done will probably by the end of 26, 27 have come to the end of that. So one of the arguments we're making to the Treasury is we don't think the funding model, we think we're near the end of the funding model, because we don't think there are very significant assets, as the way they were in Tokyo and Bangkok, that we could realise to fund future capital. So we think we need, in the second phase of the SR, a more consistent capital funding stream from the Treasury.
Equivalent to roughly what would the budget look like?
I don't know whether we've got that far in our planning for the second phase of the SR in terms of being able to put a figure on it, but we wouldn't want to add on the figures going forwards.
So we have a forward-looking global asset plan that runs way out into multiple years. So we know that over time we'll have cumulatively in the order of £1 billion worth of estates work that will go through the system.
Over what period?
We're currently spending in the sort of values of sort of relatively low hundreds of millions of pounds a year through drawing down our banked receipts. We will have a conversation with Treasury in the usual way in the next phase of the spending review as to what the kind of funding solution will be over that spending review period. We don't anticipating settlement with Treasury beyond a spending review period. The negotiation's always bound. So we have in our own minds the very long term. We negotiate with Treasury over the medium term, and then we have a kind of short-term handling where we work out how much we draw down, how we spend, how we sequence the estates. With all big programmes, there's sometimes a trade-off between time and quality and cost. So we might slow things down or speed them up, where there's the optionality around that. So the budget isn't a static annual to annual to annual. At the moment, it's financed by pulling down from banked receipts. But what we'll probably do is once we've exhausted the receipts, we'll be in a world of more annualised budget plans. But we have yet to see from the Treasury what the overall approach is to capital infrastructure over the second phase of the spending review, because it hasn't yet launched.
You know what your needs are, because the National Audit Office reckons that your annual maintenance budget is £250 million a year and presumably only going up with ageing assets. So if you've got a run cost of £250 million increasing every year, and you're nearly out of the drawdown that you can make from sales that you've got so far, my question is, how much do you need from the Treasury going forward? Or is there any other assets that you envisage having to sell because the Treasury won't make up that money?
On sales, as I said, I don't think there are significant assets which we'd ever contemplate selling. So I think we're coming towards the end of that as a way of funding our capital requirements overseas, and obviously in the end it's for ministers to decide, but I can't personally see a world where that works going forwards. On the figures, I'm not sure I recognise the 200 and 150. What we've done over the last year is we've basically done a very, very big review to absolutely get to the bottom of our global maintenance requirements and the backlog. And I think that will then tell us what sort of funding stream we need going forwards. I think, Tim, 250 million is a bit high for the annual ongoing costs, but on maintenance maintenance alone. But I think that's the sort of hundreds of millions is the sort of order of magnitude. I don't want to sit here today and give you a figure. What is and isn't the right amount. We've got a bit more work to do. We do need to discuss it with the Treasury.
Okay, so I guess where I'm trying to go with this is if we accept the National Audit Office's number or several hundred million, whatever you want you want it to be, and we run out of receipts from drawdown, and there isn't anything left to sell, and the Treasury isn't making up the shortfall, you hit a cliff edge, at which point you have to reduce the service provision that we're making.
I think there are some tough choices ahead for a particular funding envelope. In the end, I worry that we've, for many, many years now, stretched the elastic very, very tight. And, I imagine a lot of my predecessors felt the same, so I'm be a bit cautious about knowing exactly when it will snap. But I think there are limits to how much further we can go without making some more significant choices about our global network and our global footprint.
So if you do run out of money, given this is your last appearance before the committee, what's your parting shot on what should they, what should the Foreign Office cut then?
It's not for me to decide what we should or shouldn't do in future. I think my parting shot is I don't think the current funding model works for very much longer, so we need a new model, and then we need a proper departmental conversation with the Treasury, recognising completely the fiscal situation and the pressures, and also we're not alone in the wider public sector of having a challenge around an estate and maintenance requirements. Ours just happen to be overseas and therefore a little more complicated in how you do the maintenance. We're not alone in having that challenge. We need a proper grown-up conversation about what the requirement is going forwards to maintain the sort of presence that your ministers choose to have as the UK's international platform. It's just worth remembering we provide the platform for the whole of the UK government, 30 different departments, 170 odd countries, 280 plus cities. So it is actually a very, although it's not by any means the biggest compared to the wider UK public sector, it's actually a very complex network, and actually a big part of what the FCDO provides for the whole of government is an international platform.
What, John next and then Blair?
Just very quickly, the Foreign Office has embassies, often for historic reasons, in very iconic buildings which are in prime locations in cities. Now, I'm sure the Treasury would say, well, actually, we could sell it and raise huge amounts of money and move to a nice concrete building in a suburb. Do you recognise that actually the UK's reputation and presence is to some extent a result of maintaining those buildings? And are you confident that we haven't already damaged that by some of these sales?
So I don't think we've done significant damage, for example, to our relations with Japan through selling 1/3 of our compound there, keeping 2/3, and we're actually now kind of reprovisioning that with some of the proceeds. I think we did manage to do that in a way that didn't cause a problem. I think what I would say is there are some places, and that was an example, where the difference between the kind of the real estate value of a piece of property and what you kind of got out of it, and in that case it's actually staff housing and things we didn't really need anymore. There's a very big discrepancy, and we realised that in selling it. Where I think we've got to is I don't see, as I look across our global estate, and from time to time we also get this looked at by external experts and valuers, I don't see somewhere where there's a big discrepancy between the actual realisable cash value of somewhere and the value we get as the United Kingdom through having, I don't know, a very nice residence in central Paris or the residence we've just refurbished in Washington, for example. So that's the other reason why I say I think we're at the end of our funding model. So I don't see a gap, as it were. But I think the honest answer to your actual question is I don't think we've done significant damage to bilateral relationships through what we've done so far.
And obviously the world changes constantly, and new countries emerge, others become more important. Is there any possibility of the Foreign Office wishing to open new embassies?
We've had over the last, I would say, 10 years, a modest but not insignificant expansion. Parts of Africa, some of the places in the Pacific where we've closed, we've reopened, which I think is important, including for geopolitical reasons. I'm not, at the moment, we have no current plans, I think would be the phrase in terms of further expansion. I mean, I'm not sure we will be getting any larger going forwards, not least given the pressure on our resources. But we have expanded over the last. I think we've added probably between 10 and 20 new posts in the last 5 to 10 years.
The constraint on opening new embassies or consulates is financial rather than necessarily what would be good for the UK.
Well, in the end, if you kind of look at the few remaining countries where we don't have a presence, they are inevitably the ones where the relationship is less. Is some of the less important ones. We'll always have as long as we have diplomatic relations, we'll all have as ambassador or high commissioner. But they'll be non-resident, and we'll try and we do maintain the relationship kind of through people visiting rather than being there permanently.
My good Claire.
Sir John asked the question I was going to ask, so we can press on.
Very well behaved. Claire, I think you've got some questions on the odour.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sir Philip. I thought it might be a good place to start to follow on from where my colleague left off, actually, with your reflections on the merger and just thinking in terms of ODA, and you set out the very different world that we do find ourselves in from the one that we thought we might, and indeed in terms of the politics of it as well. And so I was wondering, based on your reflections from that, whether you felt that the strategic case, we talked a bit about process before around the merger, but the strategic case for the merger in the world we do now live in, do you feel that's still sound, or is there a case for them not remaining just within one department? Would aid perhaps thrive if based elsewhere?
I do think the strategic case remains, because I think if you look at it from, say, the development end of the periscope rather than perhaps the geopolitical one, what are we trying to do in the world? Trying to help the absolute least fortunate and poorest. So that could be kind of emergency humanitarian relief, akin to the announcement we've made in the last day on Sudan, or it could be long-term support, for example, in health or education. But if you want change to be sustainable, it actually requires political change as well, and influence, and it requires growth and economic development and opportunity, and that is where the kind of diplomatic influence and the sets of relationships and the way in which we can engage by doing things together actually means you can achieve more on the kind of pure development side as well. So I do think there's a kind of external impact case for the merger, in addition to the process points I was making earlier.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to turn briefly to the FCDO's priority outcomes now, particularly priority outcome 3. Now, for the benefit of those watching at home, I'll read that out very briefly. That is to reinvigorate the UK's leadership role in international development to tackle shared global challenges, respond to humanitarian crises, and support the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I'm sure you would appreciate that's quite a lot to pack into one objective or one outcome there. And I wonder about your reflections, because there's quite a lot there that's meant to focus on the long term, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I wonder about the negative consequences for those, perhaps, while ODA has had to be stretched so much to focus on so many humanitarian crises, and whether you feel there is a strong case to be made for ring fencing some of the ODA funds indeed, so that it can have that focus on the long term, while there are additional funds from some other source that is focused primarily on those humanitarian crises.
Just to note, I'm going to answer your question, but just to note that's the outcome delivery plan agreed up before the general election, so sort of inherited by the current government, and one of the Foreign Secretary's 3 reviews is on development and how we achieve more and how we rebuild our capability where that's gone down. I do think actually, if you look at how we allocate our money on ODA, it's bilateral programs, some of which are long-term, multilateral, some of it's immediate humanitarian response, but a lot of it actually is very long-term work on things like climate finance or money going to the World Bank. So I do actually think we are still spending the bulk of our development assistance on long-term projects and programming. So I'm not sure there's a need to ring fence it. I don't think it's been dragged into. There's some areas, for example, Ukraine, where there has been some reprogramming, but overall, I think it's still the vast majority is on long-term programming work.
The challenge, and you touched on it earlier as well, of ODA, the decrease that the last Conservative government brought in terms of reducing 0.7 to 0.5, and you're trying to stretch less over more. So it's just your reflection on that would be interesting, because again, it's just we're keen to make sure that the funds are going where they're meant to go, and that long-termism for development is vital, as well as the humanitarian crises, and whether we're trying to do too much with one fund.
So I think it was remembering back to the autumn of 2020 in that financial year, on top of the reduction that already happened because of the fall in GNI, to take at that speed that much money out of the budget was really, really hard. It meant shutting programs. It meant disappointing partners. It meant when people said to me, Philip, you've become an unreliable partner, I didn't feel I had a strong argument to rebut that, to be totally honest with you, because we had had to disappoint people, really tough. We also reprogrammed some big multilateral expenditure to the right, because it's a long-term into the portfolio approach, which meant for future years we had pressures. So in terms of looking ahead, I think through the review and the Foreign Secretary and the Development Minister's consideration, I think there will be some choices about what are the themes that the government and we as a department are going to prioritise in terms of the long-term areas we want to do more or less of, recognising that that 0.5 kind of less what goes to other government departments, including on Indonesian refugee costs. Actually, the budget is significantly lower than what it was a few years ago overall. That said, we are still amongst the largest ODA spenders of G7 countries.
Thank you, and thank you for your honesty there as well. Do you think that cut has had an impact on the UK's soft power?
Yes, I think it has. I think in some quarters, we were seen as slightly having withdrawn from that area. We've been very clear global leaders in that space. I think we're now we're stepping back into that effectively, and we're looking at we lost a bit of capability, and we're rebuilding that. We're working out exactly what that looks like in practice, and I think we are regaining some lost ground.
Thank you. Last one from me, and I'll hand over to colleagues. It's just the OBR has said that it doesn't expect the fiscal circumstances to allow that increase in ODA to come from 0.5 to 0.7% within this Parliament. What do you expect this timeline to look like in reality?
I wouldn't second guess the OBR. To be totally honest with you, they're the ones with the expertise.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Afra.
Just had a couple of follow-up questions on ODA, specifically around the kind of themes of what it's spent on. From the National Audit Office 2023-24 report, they found that 7.7% of the ODA budget was being spent on projects or in countries that did not meet the criteria for ODA spending. Can you elaborate a bit on this? On these kind of cases, and given that they do fall outside of the broad definition of ODA spending, if there's a kind of reason why the money was spent on these projects?
I would be guessing unless Tim or Corin knows, we might have to write to you on that. I don't know, unless it was some sort of partnership arrangement for a programme with effect somewhere else, which I would have to look into it. I don't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we'd have to look at it.
That's fine.
Could be the International Climate Finance Fund.
Just when you look at it, it's on page 10 of the report, so it'd be great to hear more about that once you've had a chance to look into it.
And wait a minute. So that was a question about that's on page 10, Alfred. I mean, if it's possible for people to look at this and to write us a note, that might be. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that would be very.
Can we do that then? I think it's important to get an answer.
And then just wanted to ask another question around kind of themes of spending. Between 2019 and 2023, ODA spending on support for asylum seekers and refugees looked to rise by about 24.8% to a total of 4.3 billion. Just wanted to get your thoughts on whether this is what you feel is a good use of ODA finances.
So the model is if the government and successive governments have taken the approach that basically things that can be under the OECD's Development Assistance Committee's rules can be scored as ODA. generally scored as ODA against a GNI target for overall government expenditure, now temporarily 0.5. So it is legitimate for governments of the day to choose to do that.
So just, I mean, given that is the kind of way that things have gone, obviously it's increased substantially, just wondering what your thoughts are on kind of the impact on projects that might be promoting British soft power abroad is, if we're focusing on spending on these asylum and refugee.
So obviously there's a cost pressure in the UK and on the Home Office and ultimately the Treasury and the Exchequer, and that money has to be found from somewhere. It's incredibly welcome. The approach the Home Secretary's taken was made clear at the time of the budget to drive down those costs over time, because that will have a direct impact on the amount of money available to the FCDO to spend on development assistance overseas. Clearly, sat where I am in my role, I would much rather the money came to the FCDO and we spent it on programmes overseas. But I do recognise, as I said earlier, A, it's within the DAC rules, and B, the wider pressures on government finances.
If I can just come back on your earlier question.
Yes, good.
So page 10 in the pack is about the totality of FCDO's overseas programmatic spend.
Okay.
The vast majority of that is ODA, but because of the merger, we've got a whole bunch of non-ODA in things like international subscriptions, BBC World Service, British Council, international programmes that the Foreign Office kind of legacy department run. So that's quite a sizable amount of money in the overall programmatic spend, and it's all disclosed in the accounts.
So the 7.7 is a reference to non-ODA?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Uma.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sir Philip. My weekend reading included Civil Service World, and they had quite an interesting article where they have a quote from you, and it said, in response to questions about aid budget cuts, that you said these cuts have damaged the FCDO's reputation as a reliable donor. This article was from April 23rd, 2024. Obviously, this was in response to decisions made by the previous government. And linking this to Priority Outcome 3, UK's leadership role responding to humanitarian crises, I just want to draw your attention to three things and ask you a question. So, one, on Afghanistan, there was a 41% cut to FCDO's basic services programme in Afghanistan, including the World Food Programme's rations programme. In Sudan, where there is a significant humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian programme was slashed by 49%. A further 45% cut to the FCDO's governance programme, which says it hindered support to improve political representation, in particular participation for women and young people. And then finally, in Ethiopia, cuts to the health programme of 87%. I'd like to know, in light of what I've just set out, what representations were made to ministers at the time, in the previous government, ahead of those decisions. I'm reflecting on a question that the Chair asked you. If you knew what you know now, what would you do differently?
Sorry, are you referring to the decision to step down from 0.7 to 0.5?
The decisions here, so some of the impacts to cuts of the programmes I've just set out from the FCDO, and your analysis that there was damage to our reputation as a reliable donor. What would you do differently?
So the government took a decision, it was announced in the budget. As is always the case with the budget, that is not widely revealed. So once we knew the decision had been taken to step down from 0.7 to 0.5, we looked at the overall commitments that we had. We looked first at where we had a legal obligation, often with your multilateral commitments, for example, to the World Bank. Actually, there's a legal requirement to pay money in a certain time frame, and then we looked at that. So that's in a sense non-negotiable, and then we looked at where the money was, and we went through a process of what are the overall priorities, and I think the then Foreign Secretary did say in Parliament what the overall priorities are, and we looked through and we asked all of our teams whether they were kind of multilateral programmes, whether they were programmes in countries but run from headquarters, or whether countries run from our network of posts overseas, to go through all of their programmes against the priorities, but also against a value for money decision. sometimes if a programme's nearly finished, actually the most value for money thing you can do is finish it off. Something which has only just started might be slightly easier to close. So we asked them to make a quick value for money assessment, and then we took overall really incredibly tough, for all the reasons you illustrate, decisions of which programmes to close or to postpone or to reduce and which to continue against the overall envelope we were given.
Can I just come in with a
Yes,
follow-up?
please do. Yes.
Thank you, Sir Philip. Were any representations made ahead of these decisions? Did ministers ask you about an analysis of what their proposed cuts at the time would do
before
to
the
some
decision
of
to step down from 0.7 to 0.5?
Yes.
There was an opportunity to make representations.
Can I just cut in here, because I think that the questions that Uma has asked, in particular to particular programmes, so the programme in Ukraine, in Sudan, what was the third one?
It's Afghanistan, Sudan and Ethiopia.
Yeah, I mean the proportion of cuts are truly shocking. Just what the scale of those cuts are. And I appreciate you had to make hard decisions, and I appreciate that the overall decision about cutting back on the amount of overseas development money was not in your hands. It was ministers. But nevertheless, I think it's right. I think it's quite right for Uma to kind of hone in on these and to be asking specifically, who on earth made the decisions to cut those budgets by that amount?
Tim should jump in. I've got the figure on from memory. Halfway through the financial year, we were asked to take £3.5 billion out of the budget. That involves some really challenging choices. In the end, the decisions were taken by ministers.
Okay. Can I ask you some questions about the budget? Because it's a little bit foggy when looking at this. The first thing seems to be that there's going to be a slight increase over this year and next by an average of 1.8%. Is that right, in real terms?
Tim, is that the right figure?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Take total DEL. Yeah.
Okay. And then, and so the budget confirms that the increases are driven by ODA spending, but how will the latest spending announcements affect the other areas of FCDO spending?
So overall, like most government departments, which aren't protected, we've been asked to absorb inflationary pressures on our running costs budget. The things we've got a bit of additional money for are, on the one hand, for a voluntary, and emphasise the word voluntary, exit scheme to allow us to reshape and refresh our overall workforce. And some money which we're just working through exactly what that looks like in practice to allow the BBC World Service to continue broadcasting where they're broadcasting now. Do you want to add anything else, Tim, on the overall shape of the non-ODA parts of the SR, the first phase of the SR?
I don't think so. I think that captures it.
Can I just ask then about this, because there's some other thing I just don't get this. So the FCDO's main estimate for this year shows that compared to last year's final budget, you plan to spend 73.5 million less on day-to-day spending resource and 65.3% less on capital. I don't understand that. If you're supposed to be having an increase in your budget, why have you got an estimate that you're going to be spending so much less?
Underspend.
And then there's something else I don't understand as well. You're also committed to making efficiency savings of 79.5 million in this financial year. So you're making efficiency savings of 79.5 million you're committed to, and you're going to be spending all this money less, which is 73 plus 65 less, and your budget's going up. So you appreciate why I'm confused.
Let's go.
And last year, in your 23 to 24, the FCDO underspent by 174 million. So you're getting more money, you're underspending, you're volunteering to do efficiency cuts, and you're spending less. Anyway, honestly, just the public watching this and trying to understand the Foreign Office's budget, they might I may not be the only one who's confused.
So we have a planning budget that's set for us by the Treasury through negotiation and spending review.
Yeah.
We set plans at the start of every year and lay the mains estimate to Parliament. We then adapt as we go through the year and lay supplementary estimates. And quite a lot can change in the course of a year, particularly with a department that largely delivers programmes. So on the ODA side of the house, we have 571 programmes with a total whole life cost of £60 billion. As we were talking earlier, we move things forward and backwards, slow things down, speed things up. So the budgets can move around. On the operating costs, the numbers in the estimates reflect that in the previous spending review in 2021, like all the rest of the government, we were tasked with finding efficiencies. And so the numbers you can see, they're both largely the same set of numbers, around 70 million of efficiencies that we signed up to. And I think what you're seeing in the numbers is effectively that work its way through, that we're making our efficiency savings as planned, allowing for slight variation.
So your efficiency savings, are they the same as the main estimate saying that you're going to spend less?
Broadly comparable in that the efficiency savings profile we agreed with the Treasury was to save progressively more as we went through the spending review period. I don't think the numbers are necessarily exactly comparable because they'll be netting off other increases in there against the efficiency savings. So although the two numbers are quite similar, they, I think, are not quite describing the same thing.
Can you write to us and explain this? Would you mind? Just to write and explain just how this all works, because I'm listening hard, but I think it would be helpful if you wouldn't mind writing and just explaining, how this works out, please.
Yeah, happy to do that.
And then can I just go back to the underspend? So according to the 23-24 annual reports, the FCDO underspent £174 million of resource DEL and £139 million of capital DEL last year. The budget allocations for 23-24 are updated at the supplementary estimates on the 27th of February 24, just a month before the end of the financial year. So why were your forecasts so different?
So we have a number of smaller ring-fenced budgets that are provided to us by the Treasury to cover things like depreciation and impairment charge, foreign exchange movements.
That's not all foreign exchange movements, is it?
Operating income as well. So cumulative each of those things are kind of roughly tens of millions. The agreement we have with the Treasury is that we don't try and be overly precise on the forecasting for those quite volatile elements. We can't recycle the money. The terms and conditions of our spend review settlement is we don't channel FX gains back into running the pay bill. So we hold all of those small budgets kind of effectively separately, and in any given year, they can run up relatively sizable underspends against each one, and then cumulatively you add them all up, it looks like quite a big figure. But individually, they're not that big a set of differences.
So they're not things we could have spent on departmental activity, because if we'd needed them, they would have gone on things like foreign exchange movements, because we didn't need the money. Obviously, then there's the savings to the exchequer, but it's not a missed opportunity by having those underspends in general.
But it's 174 million of resource and 139 million of capital.
Because in the end, the Treasury and we agree with this. It's basically the Treasury want to make sure we have enough money. So you go through the supplementary estimates, making sure you have enough money, and then these are volatile. And they've got more volatile in recent years, volatile budgets, and so there's a premium on underspending a bit rather than overspending and breaking your parliamentary control totals.
Do you mind writing to us about the underspends as well and just explaining that?
Yeah.
And can I just ask them, just before we move on, I mean, what reassurance can you give the committee that we're not going to end up with that sort of scale of underspends this year?
So I think what we were explaining is this is what happens every year because of the way the Treasury give us the money for these things like accounting adjustments and foreign exchange risks. And so the way we are set up in terms of our budgets and how they work, we've had similar underspends every year for the last years. We cannot recycle the money in. Treasury do not want us to breach our budgets by making kind of heroic forecasts and being overly precise. So as we come into the financial year, we hold these buffers on these small budgets so that we don't go over. We'll underspend by these amounts
every year.
Is there any indication that if you're accurately forecasting that over a sustained period that the Treasury would reduce your headroom?
Potentially. if we were to see, I mean, over the
But if
last
it's happening every year, why doesn't the Treasury just go, well, you're always going to have that. Why should we even give you that money? You're always going to underspend by this amount.
I think the fact that the Treasury haven't preemptively cut the budgets for this demonstrates that they are quite volatile, that the Treasury don't feel confident to pare our budgets
You
back
say on the
in.
one hand they're volatile, on the other hand you tell us that it's always the same every year.
It's not exactly the same.
Okay. Yeah. All right, but if you would write to us, and I would really appreciate it, because I clearly don't get this. Matt, I think you were going to ask some questions.
Thank you. Yes, I think a few colleagues have mentioned your priority outcomes for 23-24. I think they're obviously important for accountability, important for staff. I'm a great believer in defining success as well as defining failure. I think it's a good opportunity to learn from things. When I read through them, I think priority outcome 1 is shape an open and stable international order through strong alliances and future partnerships. It does feel slightly woolly to me. Do you think it has enough detail for us to be able to truly measure it?
I'll just go back to what I said earlier. These were outcomes agreed in the previous government before the election. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I think this challenge, they are challenging to measure, although we did have metrics which the last government chose not to publish, but we're doing our best to measure, however woolly, what the outcome described. But the Foreign Secretary has been really clear on coming in that he sees us as the delivery arm of the government overall, in particular around the missions and the foundations, and he's set us 5 policy priorities within days of taking office around putting growth and jobs at the heart of our foreign policy, playing our part in enhancing the UK security, rebuilding our relationship with Europe, restoring our leadership on climate and nature, and modernising our approach to development. We are setting up a delivery unit, and we are working through what are the metrics underneath each of those priorities that he can hold us as a department and hold ourselves to account for delivering, and we're aiming absolutely to avoid wooliness and to get to specificity, so we can say that this is what we're going to achieve in the period ahead, and we can then check up how we're getting on from time to time in a kind of classic delivery kind of way. Because I agree with the kind of what lies, I think, behind your question. It's really important, A, for us to be clear and really precisely what we can achieve, but B, to be held to account for that. I'm not sure I'd start with the outcome delivery plan. I think we're going to try and move beyond those and be focused on the Foreign Secretary's priorities.
I'm sorry, Matt, given that Richard's got to get to defence questions, I think he needs to just ask a quick question first, if that's all right.
I'm actually probably all right until about 10 to, Chair. If that's
okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm coming back to you in a minute. Sorry, Matt.
That's very gracious of you as well, Richard. Thank you. You said the last government chose not to publish metrics. Why?
I don't think they published the outcome delivery plan and from memory. I don't know. It was all decided in the centre. I don't know. But I don't think there were published metrics unless I'm.
Is that common?
I don't think any department had their metrics published. I'm slightly looking at my colleagues to check I haven't misremembered. Different governments have taken different approaches to publication of these things.
So on that point about, I'm pleased to say pleased to hear that growth will be in the new ones that we develop. I do think acknowledging failure up front is an important opportunity to learn lessons. Against those 4, obviously I appreciate there's so much happened in the world that you couldn't anticipate, but where do you think we've succeeded and where do you think actually we have failed?
Well, I mean, clearly we failed to deter Putin and Russia from invading Ukraine. So that, to the extent we did try, and we did try very hard. But in response, have we really stepped up and as the UK led international support to Ukraine across the waterfront? I mentioned the recovery conference earlier, but some military assistance and wider assistance to Ukraine, absolutely, including playing a leading role in coordinated sanctions, for example. So kind of in that one horrific, terrible invasion, I'd see both kind of a failure to deter, but also the UK and us as a department playing a very successful leadership role in the response and support to Ukraine. I'm just citing one example based in probably the biggest recent international event.
And against the 3, where have we failed? Obviously, stopping Putin, I don't think anyone would have said, that's top of your list, you can definitely achieve that. So in something we probably should have made some progress on and haven't, Or are these? Does it come back to these being slightly too woolly, frankly?
In terms, sorry, John, on the one
on
you
the
just...
on all 4 outcomes that are listed. I can read them to you.
I'm going to have to refer to them effectively.
Would it help?
Because I no longer have them at my fingertips.
I'll do it. Protect our national and international security.
Don't worry, I've got
You've
them.
got them? Colleagues just suggested maybe while you're reading them, I read them out in case anyone is watching. So 1 I've read out before. Priority outcome 2 is protect our national and international security and mitigate the threats of strategic competition through building partnerships, strengthening deterrence and effective constraint. 3 is reinvigorating the UK's leadership role in international development to tackle shared global challenges, respond to humanitarian crises and support the sustainable development goals. And 4, support British nationals around the world by providing resilient 24/7 consular services and agile crisis response. I must say, I think 4 is probably the clearest.
Yeah, I think on that we do a good job. There's always room for improvement. We've got good ways of measuring how we do that, including kind of people's views of the services we provide, and also how we work through when things go wrong. I think on international development, that's work in progress, and we've got a review going on being led by Baroness Manouche Shafiq to look both at how we get more out of doing diplomacy and development together, but also how we rebuild our capability and as I say, carry on restoring our international reputation. So I think that is work in progress. And on response to humanitarian crises and sustainable development goals, obviously resources are a challenge. We've seen a growth in humanitarian crises and need, and our resources have been constrained. So that is, say, we are doing what we can, but that part is challenging for resource reasons. On the security one, that's a partnership with the Ministry of Defence and agencies and others, Home Office charged with the security of the UK. And I think overall, particularly in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a more hostile world generally, I think the FCDO has done effective work. On the first one, shaping an open and stable international order, it would be hard to claim that's the way the world has headed over the last few years. So I think that probably is and was an over-ambitious objective, given the trajectory of the world, more volatile, more contested, more challenging.
I think that ties nicely into your lessons learned at the start about over-ambition. If I may, Chair, on last one, thank you. On lessons learned, under Priority 3, responding to humanitarian crises, clearly what's happening in the Middle East, there are huge issues. What lessons can we learn about our failure to get aid into Gaza, about our failure to retrieve British
Tel Aviv and Jerusalem last week, partly to sort of show solidarity with our own people there, including our Palestinian Israeli colleagues, also our UK staff who've been working under relentless pressure for well over a year now, since the 7th of October 2023. And I met the mother of the British hostage, Emily Damari, in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, and one wanted to show understanding for her anguish and the desperate situation that she and the other British related and all the hostages are in. And we will carry on doing everything we can to influence those trying to secure their release. So far that hasn't been successful, and we'll carry on supporting the families and supporting those efforts. And we've been calling for a long time now for a ceasefire and the hostages to be released, and we'll carry on using all of our diplomatic influence to try and secure that. On the humanitarian situation and the horrendous situation in Gaza, I talked to some of the humanitarian agencies involved, particularly but not only on the UN side when I was in Jerusalem, but also talked to our staff. It is incredibly challenging, and I think we will carry on doing what we can to persuade the government of Israel to let more aid in and to remove some of their constraints on the ability of the UN agencies and others to operate, and you'll have seen, the Prime Minister's very clear statement around our support for UNRWA, for example, which is fundamental to the delivery of assistance, so we'll carry on using our influence to the extent we can.
Move on to staffing. I think Abdesam and
Richard was going to go next.
Oh, was Richard going to go next?
Oh, yes, I thought you were going to.
Yeah, right. No, we'll go on to Richard next. Sorry. Actually, yes, because you've got to get going. I'm just trying to juggle everything. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Yes,
yeah,
Edward. Richard, do you mind asking some questions about the EU?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sir Philip. I'd like to ask about the way that the government has decided to take EU relations out of the purview of the FCDO and move it into the Cabinet Office. And I wonder how that sits, given that the FCDO is to retain responsibility for Europe's strategy and business as usual bilateral relations. But the Cabinet Office is now expected to take on responsibility for the UK's relations with the EU. Isn't this separating two functions that ought to sit together?
I think you can cut things up in different ways. I mean, it's not that different from the situation of how Europe work was divided when we were a member state, where you had a central team and a central EU advisor to prime ministers, but you also had the then FCO charged with the bilateral relationships with European countries, whether they were member states or not. So it's, in a sense, it's obviously we're no longer a member state, so it's a bit different. But I actually think it's perfectly possible. For me, it's all about collaboration, and are we and the Cabinet Office going to work in a collaborative way? We're absolutely set up to do that and determined to do that. The Foreign Secretary, the Minister for Europe, Minister in the Cabinet Office, ultimately the Prime Minister chairing the Europe Committee, which looks at the government's all-over approach, I think are determined to take a unified approach to this under the new arrangements. And if you look at the kind of individuals who've gone over to the Cabinet, I mean, they've been working together in one team, so there's very effective and close collaboration between the individuals involved.
How many individuals have moved?
It's about 50 who've moved over.
Right. And I mean, is that really enough FCDO expertise to move, given that yours is the strength around negotiation and diplomacy?
So I think it is. I think if you look at the substance of what the government wants to talk to the European Union about, some of it's obviously about negotiation, but some of it's actually really understanding. I don't know. Phytosanitary arrangements. If the government ends up in a discussion around phytosanitary arrangements, you actually need the people who understand the phytosanitary arrangements in the UK and where we might want to make an agreement. So you kind of need both your diplomatic and your negotiating expertise and understanding of European Union countries and the European Union where it's coming from, but also your deep sectoral expertise in different areas depending on the policies you're discussing.
And last one from me on this subject. We heard last week from the Governor of the Bank of England talking about how the UK's exit from the European Union had weighed upon the economy and that we should be alert to new opportunities, to welcome new opportunities. What role might the FCDO have in that?
On the economic side?
In terms of its, when we're talking with the European Union, if all of this is now within the responsibility of the Cabinet Office, what residual responsibility will the FCDO have?
I think there's two things I'd point to. One is clearly there's some things about our relationship with the European Union which are absolutely the department's responsibility. So the Foreign Secretary was invited to go to the Foreign Affairs Committee and visited and agreed with the High Rep Borrell that we would thicken up our collaboration on foreign policy and security policy issues, and we will take that forward. And then there's a set of bilateral relationships we're in the process of improving. I mean, the most notable is the one with Germany, where we are 3/4 of the way through agreeing a new treaty, and we'll pick that up again when German politics allows that. And we are going systematic through all our bilateral relationships and looking at where and how we want to thicken those up in light of the government's reset with Europe.
Just following on from what Richard was asking, I think that we've also heard, in terms of new priorities, that the Foreign Office has one of its top priorities is supporting growth generally. Would you mind giving us perhaps a short short overview as to what role the Foreign Office can have when it comes to growth.
And I'll be incredibly short because the Foreign Secretary's asked Sir Martin Donnelly to do a review on absolutely what more and better looks like in terms of our economic diplomacy. That's both around kind of where and what we should be doing in terms of where can we help secure the most growth for the UK, but also what capability have we got and what capability do we need to build to do that in the best way. It's everything from securing individual contracts or investments or taking up with other countries where British companies have been unfairly treated, through to the political advice and influence we can give to DBT as they look to negotiate free trade agreements and everything in between, including kind of aspects of regulatory diplomacy. But Martin's review, which we'll report later this month, will have a much more sophisticated answer.
Okay, thank you. Afra, I think you had some questions on the EU.
I think both you and Richard have covered them now, so I'm happy to move on. Thank you.
And Uma, did you have any?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Sir Philip, what impact has responding to international crises, such as the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, of which tomorrow marks the 1,000th day, sadly, and the Middle East and the worsening situation in Gaza, had on the FCDO's ability to deliver on its core priorities, especially thinking about Priority 1 and Priority Outcome 1 and Priority Outcome 2, which is shape an open and sustainable international order through strong alliances and future partnerships, and Priority Outcome 2 is to protect our national and international security.
So I think this remains the case. If you look at what the Prime Minister said on the way to Brazil for the G20, supporting Ukraine in response to Russia's invasion is the government, it was the previous government's top international priority, and so in a sense that's woven through in terms of the two headline objectives you just referred to. Woven through those is actually now our response to the invasion. We've significantly stepped up our effort, and that's both people and including a lot more people working on sanctions, for example, but also resourcing to Ukraine. And we've also had to do our work around the world in terms of the secondary effects, for example, on food security and humanitarian situation through the spike in prices, through the increased energy costs and some of the food supply problems with when there was a period where Ukrainian grain wasn't getting out. So it's had an impact on not all, but a vast range of departmental work, both the kind of direct effects of the invasion, but also more broadly.
I just ask one short follow-up. So, just to be clear, so in your opinion, the FCDO does have the resource it needs to progress some of these pressing matters, especially since the situation in the Middle East is worsening, and we've heard from my colleague, the UK's role in the ceasefire, in securing the release of the hostages, and working towards a two-state solution.
I think in people terms, we've absolutely got the people we need to deal with the highest priorities, and you've listed the highest priorities, so that the people are not a constraint. I think on financial resource and development assistance, all permanent secretaries are going to say they want more money, and I would say the same. But I do recognise, as I said earlier, the fiscal constraints on the government and the chancellors operating under. So I understand why in the end there's some tough choices that have been made and will continue to have to be made. I think our job is to make the best use of the resources we have and to achieve the maximum effect against the priorities of the government.
I move back to staffing then. I must have another try at and Sam, can I bring you in?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sir Philip. So I have a question in relation to the diversity of the organisation. There is a significant percentage gap between the number of people from an ethnic minority at the bottom of the scale compared to the top, with a 20% difference when you compare that to a 12% difference in gender. I think my first question is, what specific action is being taken in relation to the lack of diversity at the top? And then just to follow up on that, there is a specific percentage in terms of the number, the 37% of directors in the UK. The UK-based directors are women. What's the breakdown in terms of ethnic minorities at director level? Because my understanding is it's significantly lower than the 11% for people at the senior level. So what specific work is being done to address the underrepresentation?
And to ask Corin to add as well, in headline terms, you're right. If you look at our aim is to reflect the UK in all its diversity as us as an organisation. If you look at the headline figures, we do, but not when you go to more senior levels. We have improved at more senior levels since the department was recreated. So on ethnic minorities, gone from 7% in the senior civil service to 11.6%, but that's still not in the right place. We've also improved at what I would describe as the kind of middle level of grades 6 and 7, which does now does reflect the UK population. But we've got more to do. We've tried to both understand better the data, but also support people through things like sponsorship and mentoring and schemes to help them get promoted and progress. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to your question on directors, so we'll have to come back to it. But Corin, do you want to add what else we're doing on the race side?
Yeah, so as an organisation, we've got a race action plan, which is targeting interventions across different grades. And as you noticed, the real challenge for us is getting people up into the senior civil service level. So we're focusing interventions by DG area. So for each of our directors general, we've got an action plan around sponsorship and talent management and ensuring that we've got interventions in local parts of the business to help support our diverse talent and encourage them partly to think about opportunities at the next level up, but also to make sure that we're monitoring and keeping track of how we're doing and keeping track of, for instance, the diversity data around appointments or around promotions as we're going through. And then particularly around ethnic diversity, we're also looking at the breakdown within the wider category of ethnic diversity, and we're not doing as well as we want to do, in particular around our black staff. So we've got a new Black Employee Association, for instance, that we work very closely with to try and work out how we can better support our staff to do well in the organisation, to thrive and to be promoted. We're also doing a race culture inquiry, which we're just scoping at the moment to try and help us along that path.
Can I ask in terms of directorship, because I think the directors is for me where it's concerning, that my understanding is there aren't any. Is there work being done to ensure that the directors reflect the diversity of the population as well?
It's not quite true there are none, but you're right, we're way under, and that's probably
lower than the 11%. So I think
you're right. I think all of the things we're talking about in terms of helping people promote and progress, designed to help have people fill director level positions going forward. So I'd hope that over time that number improves.
Would you send us the information in terms of the number of directors, please? And then just final question in terms of ethnicity pay gap reporting, is that taking place, and could we have those figures if they are there?
Ethnicity pay gap I'm not aware of. Do we do that?
I don't think we've got official reporting on that, but we can take that away and look at what we know around ethnicity and pay gap.
But I think you've got to... Can I keep it short, though? Because I want to get on to the other
ones. No problem at all. You started off in your opening statement, Sir Philip, talking about the fact that the world has become more volatile and less predictable, and the need to be more agile in the FCDO response, as well as thinking ahead to future risks. With that in mind, there was a 7% increase in the number of individuals helped by who received consular services last year on the year before. What is the predicted forecast going ahead in terms of how many more people you're expecting to have to help? Is the FCO staffed in order to be able to support increasing numbers of people needing support? And if it's not, is that purely down to budgetary constraints?
So I would have to come back to you on what our actual prediction is for the year ahead. I think we if you look through the last few years, obviously had a phase through COVID where people stopped travelling almost completely for things like holidays. A lot of our demand fell away, but we've now seen it rebuild mostly to pre-COVID levels. The reason why I'm hesitating to say that will carry on growing is whether last year's growth was still kind of catching up from COVID, or whether we're now. So let me come back to you on our predictions for the year ahead. On your resourcing point, I think the way we're not constrained in the same way as other parts. Basically, our consular work is funded through a levy on the passport fee, and that's something that we kind of keep under review as the overall passport fees are looked at by the Home Office. And what we try and do is make sure then that the way in which that resource is deployed meets the demand against sort of changing requirements. We're looking at how we can make ourselves more efficient. So, for example, we have a global contact centre, some of it in Scotland and some of it actually in Malaga. And I visited a couple of weeks ago, and that was an efficiency we made. So all calls go into people there and can be handled from there. And we have a very good IT system behind it. It can then be basically triaged out to missions around when required, and we're increasingly using technology, for example, to deal with standard inquiries and that sort of thing to carry on kind of freeing up staff time.
Those are low intervention. If you're talking about consular service being self-funding through passport levies, those are low intervention. If 8,000 out of the 22,000 people who were helped with vulnerable people, those are complex interventions which do require more money. So I guess if we're talking about a more volatile world, you're talking about an increase in the number of complex cases the Foreign Office has to handle. So I go back to my earlier question, which is, to what extent is the Foreign Office able to handle those, and are the constraints purely budgetary?
We are able to handle the complex cases. We are able to, support people in person in countries where they need our support. We prioritise by kind of need and vulnerability, and so the much more complex cases or where there's a higher need is where we will ensure the kind of in-person intervention as required, and continue work on the most complicated and difficult cases, continue work on those, both as necessarily people in country, but also obviously teams here in the UK and up to ministers as required.
And I want to move on because we've only got 14 minutes and we have three rather weighty subjects. You have a quick question, if you don't mind. If we could have a quick answer, and then I want to move on to the other three topics.
I read your last gender pay gap, the published report. Why are men more likely to receive a bonus payment?
I think in the end there's probably some unconscious bias in the system. I mean, the one thing I'd point to on the gender pay gap is it's fallen significantly. We're now, I can't remember exactly the figure, Corin, I think it's down to some 2% ahead of the civil service, ahead of the wider economy. So more to do. It shouldn't be any percent. I agree with you, but it is improving.
On the pay gap, when can it be eradicated? What's the plan? When can we have your successor come here and tell us there is no gender pay gap?
Well, I'd hope as soon as possible, but in the end, I'd hope that if you look at the trajectory, it's significantly downwards.
I'd really appreciate if there could be a note written to us about with an actual aim, because I think actually some ambition here to stretch yourselves to achieve that would be what we need.
To do that.
And I think also if we're doing that, then it's also worth having a note as to when it is hoped that is it 11%? 11% reflected at director level as well. I think if we have both,
we have a target of
we would be a happy committee.
Happy to write.
You're even happier if you met the targets.
Delighted, yeah.
Very happy to write properly so you have it in writing. But the target for representation is 2026. But we'll write properly to you on that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Good. I want to go to John, who's got some questions on the World Service and the British Council.
Can I ask you about one or two specific areas of Foreign Office expenditure? You mentioned the fact that in the budget, the Chancellor announced that there will be an increase in the amount of money the Foreign Office provides to the World Service. Can you tell me how much that is going to be, and is there any agreement as to specifically where it should be spent?
Yeah, I can't quite yet. There's 2 months ago because we're still working out exact details with the BBC and the BBC World Service Management, and it has to go to their board. I'm sorry to not be able to put a figure on the table today, but we will let you know as soon as
when
we can.
When would that be, roughly?
How are we getting on with the BBC?
Why does it have to go to the BBC board as to how much money you're giving?
Because in the end, we agree with them, the funding arrangements, there's additional money against them keeping services open, and we just need to complete the discussions about exactly what that looks like.
When would it be?
Where are we with the BBC, Corin?
We hope very soon. I don't think you can put a specific date on it, but hopefully in the next few weeks.
And will it have strings attached? You'll say we would like
the
to see
strings around keeping open the number of services they've got open at the moment.
And you'll be aware that the Foreign Office used to fund the BBC and the World Service in its entirety. It was then fully funded by the licence fee, and now it's partially funded for you and partially by the licence fee. The Director General has made it clear that he doesn't think that that is a satisfactory arrangement, and he thinks the Foreign Office should take back responsibility. What's your view of that?
I think it should be properly funded. I think it does really valuable work around the world. I think the BBC is the most trusted news brand of any news organisation. I think it's well over 300 million people it reaches. It's also done some fantastic emergency work. So, for example, service into Gaza, service into Sudan, service into Ukraine, set up on an emergency basis in the face of humanitarian crises in all those places. So it is really valuable in terms of funding. You're right. Some years ago, a decision was taken that it should be funded out of the licence fee, but over time that funding has come under pressure, and the FCDO, now FCDO, has put its own resources into that as well. I think as this government, and it's led by the Department of Culture, Media and Support, rather, as this government looks at the overall funding of the BBC and how it should be done, and obviously one of the things that will need to be looked at is future funding arrangements for the BBC World Service.
The Foreign Office doesn't have a view as to whether or not they should pay for it.
So my view is it should be funded properly. If there's any change involving more funding from the FCDO, that should be additional funds. Otherwise, we're cutting other activity and having to make very hard choices around cutting other activity to fund the World Service. So it should be funded properly. And if it's to be done by the department, that should be additional funds to what we have now.
Okay, can I ask you about another unquantified funding? And that's in the agreement with Mauritius over Diego Garcia. The government has announced that you are going to make an annual payment. Is that coming out of your budget, and how much is it?
At the moment, I don't think we're in a position to make public the funding arrangements. And in terms of funding arrangements around the base, we don't ever make public funding arrangements around our military operation and bases.
The MOD make public their
overseas.
arrangements over Cyprus, so if the MOD can do it over Cyprus, why can't you?
Cyprus isn't something where they make payments to other countries. So I'm talking about where we make payments around basing rights.
We're proposing to make a payment to another country, in this case Mauritius. So why can you not say how much we're going to give Mauritius?
It's not normal practice for us to reveal the value of our payments for military bases anywhere around the world. So that's the position on where we make payments around bases.
Well, I don't think that is the case with regard to Cyprus, but
Cyprus is different because it's not a base; it's sovereign territory. Obviously, in this case, we're changing the arrangements. Sorry to interrupt you.
Perhaps we should pursue this Foreign Secretary. But Baroness Chapman also said that if it was made public, then the price could go up. Do you know why that should be the case?
Well, these things are always going to be a matter of kind of political debate in recipient countries. So, in the end, if some of the things are kept, you want to keep them private for those reasons.
And lastly, can I ask you about the British Council? The British Council has been sustained by loans from the Foreign Office, particularly post-COVID. Is there any chance of the British Council, do you believe, becoming self-sustaining? And what would be the consequence if it ceased to be able to receive those funding from the Foreign Office?
You're right. In light of the impact on their business of COVID, the last government made a loan of 200 million available to support short-term cash flow problem and to allow them to restructure and begin to rebuild their commercial income. And this government and the FCDO and ultimately the Treasury stood behind that, carry on supporting that loan. We are in the process of discussing with the British Council when they can begin to repay the loan, what that looks like in terms of their future funding arrangements. I think this will probably be an issue that's looked at in the second phase, the next phase of the spending review, as we look at the medium term, including for the British Council.
But it is your intention that the British Council should become self-sustaining?
Yes.
Okay.
Does it provide value for money?
Yeah, I think it does. I think if you look at the impact it has, around the world, I mean, just by way of example, 25% of all new international students in the UK say they first learnt about the UK as somewhere to study through through the British Council, and that's an immediate and obvious value. And there's other things I could cite. So yes, I do think it produces very good value for money.
Umar, I think you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. So, Philip, I just want to step back to ask a question on the BBC World Service. I've had the joy of being interviewed by BBC Tamil, but recently I've heard from Middle East experts. They described the closure of BBC Arabic as a disaster for the region. They said it was a trusted source, and now there's no longer any impartial news at all, and it's all state coverage. In fact, shockingly, Russia Today now use the radio frequency that BBC World Service used to be on. Do you think future assessments on funding of the World Service should consider the impact on international and national security and in the impact on fair and impartial information?
I think absolutely, and one of the values of the BBC, as I said, is it is trusted, and we are seeing countries like Russia invest more in this area. But on Arabic, it's true that the radio service was closed, but television and digital remain. And one of the things the BBC World Service have looked at is how people consume the news, with over time a shift more to digital, away from radio, particularly with younger people. And that's some of the there is a Arabic service. You're right about radio, but there is still an Arabic service.
Can I move on to British Investment International, because I think that's a fairly important topic. And Edward, do you mind taking the lead on this? And Abdeslam, I think you've got some questions as well.
Yep, okay. So, Philip, just a brief question, and then let my colleague go into further questions. So, last year, the International Development Committee did some work in relation to the British Investment International, and they found a number of concerns in relation to the types of companies that we were investing in. Lots of high net worth corporate organisations, private schools, corporate hospitals, and I think this year there was an investment of 500 million in relation to a fraud suspect. The committee recommended a number of things, called for greater oversight, a non-voting minister to perhaps sit on the board, and for the entire portfolio to be aligned alongside the missions, which are creating a more productive, sustainable and inclusive economy across the world, which, according to the committee, it did not meet. What from those recommendations have been addressed?
Yeah. So the overall objective of the BII is basically to invest in capital which drives private sector growth in developing countries to create opportunity and jobs. And the way it works is they agree with the government a 5-year strategy, and under that strategy it has a target around climate finance of 30%, target around 25% of their investments enabling women's economic empowerment, and a target that by 2030 half of its investments will be in the poorest and most fragile countries, to your point about where the money ends up. In terms of governance, and this has come up a number of times, the arrangements meet the standards set by the Treasury and the Cabinet Office for overall governance of these types of organisations. The NAO described them as thorough. The FCDO is the foreign secretary, the sole shareholder. Its interests are represented by appointment of the chair and 2 non-executive directors of the BII, but it is deliberately at arm's length to individual investment decisions. So the government is not best placed, and officials in the department and ministers are not best placed to direct individual investment decisions, which are best done by the professionals employed by BII under the overall direction of the chair and the BII board.
How do we ensure that the things that the committee recommended were not working are going to be addressed? Because I think there is an overemphasis in terms of the number of post-conflict countries, fragile countries that are just not being supported, and there's an emphasis in terms of where the investment is going, and it isn't directed at the countries that need it the most.
So, as I say, there's a strategy agreed with the government which sets out the overall approach the government's asking them to take in their investments. And I've cited some of the headlines of what that strategy says. In addition to the formal governance that I've talked about, there are very, very regular meetings between Nick Dyer, who's the other permanent secretary in the department in charge of development and our ODA expenditure and the team within the department, near daily meetings with BII about how they are doing and what they are doing. But the overall formal governance is at arm's length with the Foreign Secretary ultimately appointing the chair and 2 of the non-executive directors.
I want to come back to portfolio return in a second, but before we talk about that, can you tell me, you talked about the strategy, but what are the metrics that we're actually measuring BII against and how are they being reported? Because when I look at the NAO report, all I'm seeing is the portfolio return numbers. So
I mentioned, for example, 25% on gender and women's economic empowerment, and they actually brought in, I can't remember the job title, but somebody who actually looked at impact and impact measurement, how they were doing that, and that's then reported back to us, and they've really refined how they look at development impact and the reporting.
As in outcomes, because what you've just outlined is what the distribution metric is. So I'm just wondering.
As in outcomes. Okay. And then also mentioned a target of 30% for investment in climate finance. Again, that you may see that's an input rather than an outcome. And so I'd have to give you the detail. I have to write to you, I'm afraid, to give you the absolute detail, but they are measuring their impact. And then, as you rightly say, there is also a target around the financial side.
So if we accept that the BII is achieving outcomes along the lines of the strategy in terms of development, it's the other side of that we accept that it is loss-making.
So in the end, not over time, but obviously, if you have an overall approach where you're not seeking to make the most money as possible, you're basically seeking to do good in the world and achieve development and positive development outcomes. You're seeking to crowd in private sector investment and through partnership achieve even more. As long as over time you're basically able to a bit more than break even and reinvest money you do make. A single year, which is what we had last year, where you made a small loss, is fine. I mean, the 7-year weighted portfolio return is still well over 5%.
Over the 7-year weighted average, and given that it's designed to achieve a minimum of 2%, it was loss-making in every single year apart from 2023. So, 2021, when it was up 11.2%. So it's only up now because of that 1 year. In fact, something happened in 2020, 2021 that meant that you went from negative 3.7% to positive 11.2%. Outside of that year, every single other year is loss-making. So that single year is carrying you at the moment. If the forecast carries on as the last 2 years are being, of it being negative, at a certain point it will be negative again. So my question is, does that matter? Are we just accepting that of the 400 million that we put in, a third of that is just going to be lost immediately on loss-making portfolios? And or have we looked at what happened in 2021 and said that might be a good investment strategy?
I mean, we don't accept that. We just lose a third as it goes in. Absolutely not. I mean, the purpose isn't to lose money. It's quite the opposite. It's to make a little bit and reinvest it, but against the criteria of development outcomes. I'll have to take away your point around whether there's something in 2021 to learn from. Some of the changes we've had actually are a result of exchange rate movements and the dollar sterling changes, because although the money obviously the UK government puts in is in sterling, quite a lot of their investments are in the dollar. So in some years, actually what's happened is in changing the exchange rate, changing the value of their investments, rather than the underlying value of the investments changing.
Thank you very much. We've got one further question. We've got a series of other questions that we wanted to ask. Blair wanted to ask about Abercrombie House and Scotland. But I think that we've had a good session with you, and we're very grateful for your time. And if it's all right, I think that what I'll do is I'll sit down with Blair and work out what the best series of questions are for you and send it on behalf of the committee, if that's all right.
Very happy to, and also very happy to provide an in-person briefing on that as well, if that's useful to you and Blair.
I think that he'll definitely take you up on that, definitely. I think that would be great. Thank you. And I think there are a few points that we've picked up on that you're going to write to us as well. we are very grateful to you and to Corin Robertson and to Tim Jones for giving us so much time today, Sir Philip. Thank you very much. It's been really important, I think, for our committee to begin our investigations by being able to speak to you and to race through all the points that we have. I know that all of my committee have a number of other points that they would have liked to have asked, and I'm grateful to them for being as disciplined as they have been, so that we've been able to get through the session in the right amount of time. But thank you very much, and we're looking forward to seeing the Foreign Secretary in a couple of weeks' time, and we can perhaps draw on some of your answers when it comes to asking him questions. Thank you very much. Session's closed. Order.